On the fix, we like to get to the heart of things. Welcome to our land debate. Joining me on the panel is the ANC's NEC member, Ronald Lamola. We are also joined in Cape Town by Professor Ruth Hall from the University of the Western Cape, and as well as Agri-SA's Deputy Executive Director, Mr. Christo van der Rede. Gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the panel discussion on land.
Good evening. Good evening.
Now, let me start with you, Ronald. The African National Congress met very recently with Agri-SA. You put out a joint statement, and you, of course, been meeting with a whole range of stakeholders, including the parliamentary process that, followed. Let's quickly, before we get into the substantive issues, listen to AfriForum's Mr. Roots speaking during his time in Parliament to make his presentation.
It is regularly argued, and especially in this House, that whites stole the land. This is the single biggest historical fallacy of our time. There are three ways in which white people acquired land, namely, the settlement on empty land, the purchase of land through treaties, cooperation, and agreements, and most controversial but least significant, by conquest. Then, of course, there was legislation such as the Native Land Act of 1913 and the Group Areas Act of 1950. These injustices must be dealt with, but they must be dealt with specifically and not used to construct grand false narratives or to advance new racist policies. If, however, it is your argument, as we have heard, that ownership of land by whites should be regarded as illegitimate because Africa is the black people's continent, then you should be prepared to join forces with white right-wing fascists in Europe who argue that Europe is white people's continent and that there is no place for black people in Europe. If you argue that white people in Africa shouldn't receive equal treatment, but that the rights of black people in Europe should be protected, then you are nothing other than a racist hypocrite.
That's, of course, Mr. Ernst Roots from AfriForum. He's been thoroughly slammed as someone who is on the fringe and, in fact, not in any way trying to address the question of historical injustice and the question of how to go about land redistribution and greater land justice. I want to start with you, Ronald Lamola. The African National Congress at its NEC Lekgotla, the president made a late-night announcement saying that you are intending to change Section 25 of the Constitution to make more specific the wording of what you mean. You went to great lengths, the President went to great lengths to praise the Constitution as a revolutionary document that empowers you to actually do land compensation, expropriation rather, without compensation. If this is so, why do you think it's still necessary to then change the Constitution, particularly that Section 25? And what exactly are you going to change?
No, thank you, Karima. It's very important for us to be explicit and very clear what our intentions are, because you will know that the land reform failed as a result of various factors, including challenges in government, our own failures, but also there was resistance from groups like AfriForum and many other whites in South Africa who wanted to preserve the status quo. So they challenged it through many court processes, but there was also challenges in our own government failure, which we are admitting. So if the Constitution remains unclear, it's clear that we are still going to have many challenges, which we are saying are going to go away, but at least there will be certainty. So we want to clarify that aspect in the Constitution and be explicitly clear that in certain circumstances you can expropriate without compensation. And because we know this is a drastic tool, which it's an instrument of expropriation, we are also looking at at least safeguarding it through checks and balances with institutions like a kind of a public protector institution or through some kind of a court which must be able to check and balance, because this is not just an easy instrument.
I want to bring you in, Professor Hall. You've been party to the thinking in the African National Congress around these matters. There isn't common understanding around whether or not the Constitution should be changed, despite that NEC decision. Mr. Lamola has spoken about more specific, a series of checks and balances. How much more specific can the Constitution actually be? I heard you testify in Parliament the other day, and you were arguing that the clause is adequate as it is.
Well, I think, Karima, what's very clear is there is enormous demand for land reform in South Africa. A lot of people are very angry and dissatisfied with the situation, and a lot of people are blaming the Constitution for what have actually been political and government failures. And I think that Ronald has been very upfront that that's been the case. So the question is, what do we do now? So the message that I think that we've got from government is saying, technically, government could expropriate land without compensation as long as it's just and equitable, but that would have to be judged on a case-by-case basis, and that would have to be subject to review by the courts, which would likely be a lengthy process. And I think that the ANC is trying to decide how to engage with that possibility. But I think the much bigger question right now is that maybe the Constitution has not been the constraint. And the big message that we got from the Motlanthe Commission of Inquiry, appointed by Parliament last year, reporting in November last year, said the problems of land reform, the reason why it's been slow, the reasons why elites have got land and so on, is not the Constitution. It's actually that government has not promoted a pro-poor land reform programme.
That's quite
and I've just come out of a meeting today of hundreds... Sorry?
No, go for it.
I was just going to say, I came out of a meeting today with hundreds of people gathered from around the country, land activists from communal areas, from farm workers, from urban activists and so on. And people are saying, government is not listening to us. We have concerns around land. And we see that either elites get land, we don't get listened to. When we get land, we don't get support, or we don't get clear land rights. So there are wider questions beyond this question of the Constitution that will need to be addressed.
Peter?
Ronald Lamola, I wanted to ask you whether the party, the ANC, actually knows what it wants to say in the Constitution, or are you having a discussion? Are you making it up as you go along? Because you talk about having some kind of a court, some kind of check and a balance. I mean, how far have you got? How clear are you guys in your minds about what you want to say in the Constitution?
No, we're very clear. We know what we want to do. We are not thumb-sucking. It is well researched. It comes from the land workshop, and the Constitution is going to be very explicitly clear in terms of the expropriation under certain circumstances, which the circumstances will be detailed in the expropriation bill or act. You will have seen the department
of a circumstance.
Obviously, illegally acquired land, derelict buildings, underutilized, because there's a lot of underutilized land in the country. The circumstances will be more detailed, but the ready to govern document of the ANC explicitly state them, and also the RDP document. So the ANC is not thumb-sucking, it's not looking, so it's already
we can look to those documents for guidance on what might eventually.
Yes, but it's what we are going to put in the expropriation.
I wanted to ask Christophe van der Rede whether you guys have, you seem comfortable with the process or the thinking of the ANC so far. You don't, like Ruth Hall, you don't think it's necessary to change the Constitution. How are your talks progressing? How can you help them get it right?
Look, Agri-SA is of the opinion that we sit with a legacy. And we need to deal with that legacy. That legacy has impacted very negatively on the lives of many, many people. And for us, it's critical that we address the issue. And we should stay clear from this argument that the ANC seeks to change the Constitution for political purposes. That might be so. But we must remember the masses out there are crying out for land. And how do we, as Agri-SA, play a constructive role in addressing that need? I will broadly state it later how we anticipate that to play out. But for us, it's critical that we should not change the Constitution. The Constitution makes it very clear that there's an obligation on the state to make sure that people have security of tenure. Secondly, nothing should stand in the way of the state to address the needs of people in terms of land.
Law, I presume.
Yes. So we have been engaging, and hopefully out of the engagement that we've had, the entire industry can come together and put something on the table.
Can I ask you, just listening to Ernst Roots there, right? Is there an overlap between Agri-SA and AfriForum in terms of membership? I mean, they would claim that a lot of their members live on farms and own farms. You obviously represent the farming community in SA. Where are you? Is there overlap? If you had a Venn diagram of the sort of farming communities of South Africa?
Look, it might be that some of our members are members of AfriForum.
Yeah.
And remember, AfriForum is a civil rights organization. Yeah. So there's a massive distinction between Agri-SA and AfriForum. Agri-SA focuses on agriculture. In fact, we consist of the entire value chain. And on Friday, last Friday, we had the entire value chain in one room, engaging with the ANC.
In fact, I want to come in here to talk about exactly that, Ronald. The meeting, according to everyone, went very well. There's a couple of things, I think 5 or so things that the ANC committed to in that meeting. The one was that they're going to be prioritizing unused land in rural areas, that there'll be no land grabs, protecting agricultural property rights, and that 4,000 government farms will be unlocked, and that there will also be protection of agricultural production. Now, one of the institutions that have expressed a particular concern about the knock-on effect if this is not going to be done properly is the banking sector, because most farmers, let's face it, are in debt. Banks actually own the farms. How are you going to satisfy those 5 key areas with specific emphasis on not creating a banking crisis?
No, indeed, it was a very important meeting for us because remember our objective is 1, to create commercial black farmers, but 2 is to satisfy the land hunger in the urban areas. But with AfGri, the main discussion was the part on agriculture. So we want to open up the agricultural space through land and through the entire value chain so that the more commercial black farmers don't have access to the market, they don't have to support systems, they don't have access to water rights. So it's a package of a discussion that will enable them in the mold of South Korea, which was able to use expropriation laws with compensation or minimal compensation or without compensation to open up the economy, to put a majority of the population together, an inclusive economy. And this is the discussion we're having with them to allow a lot of black people to come into the space. Some of the farmers were even saying they are also willing to mentor some of the commercial black farmers. So for us, it's a very important program which we can handle with South Africans who want to participate in building a project South Africa.
Professor Hall, I want to bring you in here. I mean, no one can disagree with what Ronald is saying on paper, but the ANC's had close on to 24 years to do precisely that. You've said you've just come from a meeting where people are saying the government's not listening to us. Last week or 2 weeks ago, you had a big gathering arranged by Landbou Weekblad, where a lot of black commercial farmers complained that they're not getting that support that Ronald is talking about. Professor Hall, do you buy the African National Congress's argument that this time around they will actually do things differently?
Well, I think that the land issue has exploded to a degree, Karima, that actually the ANC in government is going to have to take the land issue much more seriously. And I think that they've been quite upfront to acknowledge that there's been failure up to now. So let's be clear, the ANC in government could have, for the past 22 years, could have been expropriating land in the interests of land reform. It has chosen not to do so. The land reform that has happened has been on the decline, at least since 2008. There's less and less land being redistributed. What is being redistributed is going to elites. There are concerns from ordinary people. And so I think that the big question now is not so much the question of what powers does the state have, but how is it going to choose to use those powers? So I think that the Constitutional Review Committee is very likely to recommend that there should be an amendment to the Constitution, and that amendment is likely to be a small clarificatory amendment that says where it's just and equitable, the state will not compensate, but where it is just and equitable, it will compensate. I think that that's the ANC position. That's very different from the EFF position, which is to say expropriation across the board, and no compensation across the board. So that's what we're sitting with, is these two very different positions. But I think that there's now a mounting pressure from civil society, which is actually asking the ANC, the question is not what powers do you have, but how are you going to use those powers, and will you use them in the interests of ordinary people?
Peter?
Ronald, if I can just ask you as we come to the end, I mean, the words that you use in the change of the Constitution are going to be critical, and as Ruth has given us an example of what you may do. But the really difficult part may not be farming, where you've got a good and well-organized, well-financed partner in someone like Agri-SA. But in urban areas, this could get difficult and really tricky with little buildings and people, you know, that's where the rush for accommodation and housing is really tough. And if you get it right, you could trigger an economic boom if you got it right. If you get it wrong, it's a disaster. I mean, how do you approach the urban problem differently?
The urban problem is very important for us because 60% of the population that needs some kind of security of tenure is in urban areas. So there is land held purely for speculation in urban areas. There are buildings that are abandoned, absentee landlords. Those are buildings that we are going to target first with the expropriation bill to enable us to unlock those for people to be brought next to the cities where they work, sure. Because that is very important. And you will know that even China in the 2004 constitution introduced a clause that they protect private property rights for the first time in the history of China. So it shows that the global community understands that urban settlement is important and it needs some kind of security of tenure and protection. So I always hear people saying China is a different environment. But yeah. In this regard, they are very clear that private property rights need to be protected, even in urban areas and so forth. So we are very clear, and there are even laws in the housing regulatory framework. We're also looking at the spatial planning, which will enable us to dismantle the apartheid spatial planning so that we're able to reprioritize blacks to come next to the cities. But the other instrument we're looking at is some kind of a land tax for the land that is held purely for speculation. People know that if you have a land in any estate and you are not doing anything, there's some kind of penalty. But in a country, there's nothing. A person can hold the land for speculation. So those will also play a role in taking down the prices in terms of the housing and so forth. And that will also enable those who might not qualify to get housing for free to be able to get them at reasonable prices.
Well, gentlemen and lady, we are out of time, unfortunately. This is a conversation that we will probably have again. This is definitely an election question. Professor Hall, thank you so much for joining us from Cape Town. Mr. Rieder, thank you so much for coming in. Ronald, thank you for your participation. Still to come on The Fix, we explore ways to build South Africa's economy with our next expert panel. Don't go anywhere.